Welcome back to the conversation. It's still Adrienne Lawrence, and this time I'm joined by the staff writer at the New Republic covering law, democracy, and the courts. That is Matt Ford. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, so wow, last week was a stunning one with 83-year-old Justice Breyer essentially announcing his retirement after 27 years on the bench. And Biden is promising to uphold his promise of essentially putting a Black woman in his place. Essentially, you said this gives cause for hope, even if he were to put a Democratic-leaning judge on the bench, it'd still be a conservative majority. So why should we be hopeful?
Well, I think the reason for hope is that this really takes one thing off Democrats' plate to worry about. After the experience with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the sort of unfortunate timing of her passing, the court really shifted far to the right. And now with Breyer stepping aside for a younger replacement, implicitly for a younger replacement, that gives more of an opportunity for somebody younger to come on the bench and stay there for a long time. It won't be enough, of course, to reverse the tide that the court has drifted rightward, but it helps ensure that it won't get any worse for Democrats.
Oh, well, that's kind of a good thing. Although it's interesting because in my thought, it couldn't get any worse, but I think it possibly could, especially when it comes to the confirmation process. And we have that Senate Judiciary Committee that's essentially split 11-11 Dems and Republicans. But I guess, do you see that complicating anything?
It could pose one small hiccup. It could be hard for them to discharge it if they only have, as you say, 11 Democratic votes. But there is a way around that. The majority leader can file what's known as a discharge petition, sort of to bring them out of the committee and put it on the Senate floor. If he does that, it's just a clean 50 votes, no filibuster, no nothing.
Oh, well, that would be good, of course, if there aren't people like Joe Manchin out there. But I think there is already kind of talk on the streets, the thought that Joe Manchin hasn't necessarily essentially voiced any objection to proceeding with an Amy Coney Barrett type of process here. Are you hearing anything?
No, I mean, one of the things that's really been remarkable about this is that, obviously Joe Manchin's been a thorn in the side of Democrats on a lot of policy issues. But when it comes to judicial nominees, and Biden has gotten a lot of them confirmed over the last year, he hasn't been a roadblock at all. He's voted for every single one of Biden's nominees. We don't know of any instances where he's sort of played a behind the scenes role in nixing them. As far as Democratic policy interests go, he seems to be on board.
All right, well, I guess it's kind of a fingers crossed situation because Lord knows he has been a thorn in the thigh for a bit now. But in terms of those who are essentially potential candidates for that whole lifetime position, I guess, are there any front runners?
Well, one is Ketanji Brown Jackson. She's on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. She's young, she's experienced, and she was placed on the DC Circuit by President Biden. That was one of the first nominations he made this term. Now, the DC Circuit, because it's here in Washington, because it deals with a lot of cases involving federal policy, it's often considered to be the second most important court in the land. And so for Biden to place her there, it's certainly a vote of confidence in her favor for being the nominee. Now, there are others. There's also Leandra Kruger. She's a justice on the California Supreme Court. She's widely respected. And she would be a sort of another choice that could be sort of outside the federal appellate courts, where a lot of Supreme Court nominees usually come from. But the president might opt for somebody with a different professional background.
Yeah, and I think that would be wise. Just, if we're gonna add some flavor to the court, let's go ahead and spice it up, which would be good. And I'm a California girl, so I rep for my state, and that's that's just where I stood. But all right, so in terms of bringing these individuals on, how do you think that they're going to be received by the existing court? We've already heard the whispers, the very loud whispers of individuals like Gorsuch being unwilling to cater to the only woman of color on the court, Sotomayor in terms of wearing a mask in the event of her diabetes, even though they like to dispute things that happened. But I guess, how do you think the court will respond?
Well, in terms of personal dynamics, about 100 years ago, the court was a much more hostile place. There were reports of justices who wouldn't even talk to one another, who would open a newspaper when they were asking questions of a lawyer. It used to be a lot worse. Nowadays, the court likes to project sort of an outward air of collegiality. And you're right, that's sort of been punctured in recent days and sort of disputed in recent days about just how much they get along. But I think that the justices do have an interest in preserving sort of a united front. For the conservatives, there's an interest in making sure that they're seen as sort of the rule followers, that they're not being too extreme in appearance, even though their rulings may say otherwise. They want to keep up that appearance. And for the liberals, though they are a minority, they're not as out of power as it might seem in some lesser known cases. Obviously on abortion rights, they're not going to probably sway any of the justices, but they might have hope that they could sway others. So both sides have an interest in sort of maintaining a level of collegiality there.
Absolutely, and it should be rather interesting because I know that essentially, newbies to the court, they honestly oftentimes can have a chip on their shoulder and can vote in ways to kind of try to maybe dispel certain sentiments about their partisanship. And so it makes me wonder, how would this individual, being the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, actually respond, especially given this whole, let's say, social media era we live in? How do you think things could possibly go?
Well, ideally, it wouldn't factor into their mindset at all. Judges are not supposed to decide cases on that basis, but judges are human. And so there might be a certain attempt to zig or zag where that goes. Now, we've seen that from Trump's nominees. We've seen Kavanaugh and Barrett sort of surprised from time to time on sort of lesser priority issues. It's possible that we could see Biden's nominee pull something similar, but I wouldn't expect to see it on something that's really of a core belief to them. Maybe on procedural aspects, maybe on sort of the sideline things. But most judges, they have reached when they reach the Supreme Court, they have closely held beliefs, and they are often willing to stick to them.
Yes, that's something I believe I initially saw to some extent with Sandra Day O'Connor. Definitely RBG until she hit a certain, let's say, age or tenure on the court, and then she just started to go more rogue and do her own thing, which is great. You wish that a lot more of these judges would recognize that this is a lifetime position and they do not need to listen to Twitter, and they should just do with what their gut says or what their, I guess, intellectual legal gut says, and not necessarily fear any kind of pushback. But I really just don't necessarily know how that could be taken. But in terms of taking the path that would maybe help kind of balance the country and also restore more sense of maybe confidence in the court, do you think having this new potential appointee be it in terms of what the nation needs to feel like the court is more balanced?
I'd like to think it would help. The Supreme Court has sort of a unique responsibility over the American Constitution. And the Constitution, by definition, is supposed to represent all of us in a way that Congress and the presidency don't necessarily always do. Only one person at a time can do that. But the Supreme Court has sort of a collective responsibility there. Now, obviously, every nominee who's going to go before the Supreme Court is going to be well qualified. They're going to be experienced. But it's not wrong for people to want more. It's not wrong for people to want a greater diversity of backgrounds, of experiences, of sort of the life that they've lived and formed, whether it's professional, whether it's personal. That makes the court stronger. I think the best counterintuitive example is Justice Neil Gorsuch. Gorsuch is known as a conservative, but he's also a Westerner. He also spent a lot of time on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers a lot of sort of Western states. And from there, he's actually turned out to be sort of a very prominent voice on Native American issues in favor of tribal sovereignty. Now, obviously, a justice with an even more diverse background than him might have different perspectives. But that's one of the virtues of having 9 justices instead of 1 or 3, is that you can create a court that brings all those perspectives together.
Yes, and that'd be something that would be truly reflective of individuals and the diversity and the reach of our nation. And so having more representation is definitely a good thing in terms of thought, intellectual mind, but oftentimes you don't get it as much in terms of class, as you essentially have a bench of a number of Ivy Leaguers or whatnot. But hopefully this new pick will diversify. And in terms of possibly who's next on the bench, you had 83-year-old Breyer. I think he's the oldest one left. And who could be coming behind him, even if in a few years?
Well, the next oldest justice after Breyer would be Justice Clarence Thomas. Now, he was confirmed in 1991. he's been there for a long time as well. But Thomas has said that he's willing to stick it out as long as it takes. He's willing to die on the court. He's told friends and associates that he wants to stay on there as long as it takes to get what he wants to accomplish done. Now, of course, anything could happen. Health reasons might compel him to step down. But other than that, most of the justices, they are in their 50s or 60s, approaching it. And after Breyer and after Thomas at some point, it's going to be a few years before we see any other appointments. So this is going to be the last chance, not only for Biden to influence the court, but for any upcoming president to influence the court for a long while.
Yes, I would like to think Justice Thomas's wife and all the shenanigans in which she is involved in would kind of maybe light a match under his robe, and possibly he can head into, the private sector and go on about his business. But hey, that's just wishful thinking. As far as everyone else, I believe it was Amy Coney Barrett's 50th just last week. And so, yeah, we have a lot of years ahead of us with these justices if they plan to essentially stay on the bench throughout the period of their life. But in terms of people who are observing all of these exchanges with the courts, what would you say to them?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind not just how they might necessarily think about issues, but to understand how they think about their position in American government. Not as somebody who necessarily has to do everything or accomplish everything, but somebody who's committed to the rule of law as an idea, and somebody who's willing to stand up for it, even depending on which way the partisans' winds blow. Because, like you say, they could be there for 30 or 40 years, and we don't know what the country will look like then, and we want somebody of integrity who will be there deciding the law.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, Matt. Can you tell the viewers where they can find more information about you and follow your writing?
Well, they can read my articles regularly at the New Republic at newrepublic.com, or they can follow me at Twitter at FordM.
Fantastic. That's Matt Ford, staff writer at the New Republic, covering law, democracy, and the courts. Thank you so much for joining us, Matt. We really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.